that I'm the institutional knowledge of Navy leadership right now because, like I said, or as Hope said, I've only been in the job for 22 months or so. So I'm learning new things every single day about the Navy and the Department of the Navy and the challenges that we have. And that doesn't happen in a static environment because we're dealing with a pretty dynamic security situation that's evolving, as you all cover and understand the complexities of that. So it's tough. It's one of the big challenges I think we have in government is bringing people in to the government, putting them in senior positions, and then asking them to make decisions that have long-term implications for the force. And then the next thing you know, they're gone. So you don't have the opportunity to implement. I'm looking at my sort of window here as whatever 14 more months, and then I'll be turning it over to somebody else, I'm pretty sure. So whether it's someone from a continuation of this administration or a different administration. So I have to think about things in those types of time frames, and that sort of guided the way I think about the types of things that I've been emphasizing in the job. Back when I was a professor at the Air Force Academy, and Hope mentioned I was a helicopter pilot, and I wish she hadn't mentioned that I was a Huey pilot because that really dates me. As you know, the Navy doesn't even fly them anymore, and they haven't been flying them for a really, really long time. But I was probably one of the last young pilots to go into that pipeline. And I was at an LHA at the time, and down in Norfolk, and then I received my orders to go be a professor at the Air Force Academy because I earned a master's when I was at the Naval Academy in government, political science, and international relations. And so I went to the Naval Academy and I went to the Air Force Academy to teach, and one of the challenges I learned right away was that getting these young cadets excited about the topic that I was going to teach was always a big, big challenge. And so I tried to use different types of devices to get them interested. And one of the things I used to use a lot was I would videotape the David Letterman show, and I would pull out the top 10 list and I'd bring it in that morning, and I would challenge them and I challenge myself to like take that top 10 list and relate it to something that we were talking about that day. There's usually no connection between the two, but having them think about how there might be one made the subject a little bit more alive to them. So what I thought I might do is talk to you about things that I'm thinking about. And Secretary Mattis had an interesting quote, which I'm sure you've all tracked. He was asked one time what keeps him up at night. Have you all seen this video with him? They asked him, I think it was right after he was confirmed with the position. It was on Meet the Press or something like that, or one of those Sunday shows. And the reporter asked him, what keeps you up at night? And he said, nothing keeps me up at night, I keep other people up at night, which is an interesting approach to establishing yourself as somebody who is really on top of his job. Really nothing keeps me up at night because I'm really, really tired at the end of the day. My days are very, very long, and I don't have a lot of time at night, so I just kind of go to bed. But if things did keep me up at night, these would be the things. And so I thought I would give you my top 10 list of the things that, if things kept me up at night, these would be the 10 things that kept me up at night. So let's go through those. Number 10 is ships. We have a big challenge with ships right now. We've experienced significant difficulty in maintaining them, in understanding what the challenges are to the maintenance program that they're lined up to take. When we get these ships into the yard for overhaul or for periodic maintenance, we open them up and we find that there are problems that are much more extensive than we thought initially, and that starts backing up the schedule. This was exacerbated during the last administration due to sequestration, where we had to shift funding away from those types of things and those readiness things in favor of operational considerations. And so that's a big problem. We're trying to dig ourselves out of that hole. We've been trying to dig ourselves out of that hole for the last 3 years. I think we're making good progress there. But the bigger thing about ships for me is if you look at the force structure that we have right now, we're at about 290 ships. Maybe it'll be 291 on Saturday because I'm commissioning the newest USS Indianapolis on Saturday morning. But 290 ships right now is significantly below the 600 ship Navy we had when I was in the service in the late 1990s. The President and the Congress have put a very aggressive goal out there for us to get to 355 ships. And that's based on a force structure assessment that was developed in 2016, which is sort of derivative of 12 carrier battle groups and I think 104 large surface combatants, 52 small surface combatants, and a variety of support ships, 38 amphibs, and so on. If you look at what it would take to do that, and we've laid this into our 30-year shipbuilding plan, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to do that based on that, A, based on that force structure, and B, based on the budget top line that we've been given. So we're all sort of coming to this realization now that there's a math problem that we need to try and solve. And we have to be creative about how we're going to solve it. First of all, is the number 355 the right number? I don't know. I suspect it's probably more. Probably needs to be more than that. But the way we define a battle force ship, we probably have to think about that differently as well. As technology advances and we have the ability to have fairly large unmanned platforms out there that have significant lethality, do we include them in our ship force count? So we have to take a really hard look at what 355 means. If it's the right number, does it even matter what the number is? And what are we investing in for the future? So that concept of ships is something that's really, really on my mind quite a bit. And it's starting to come to a head a little bit right now as we think about this next budget and how we think about where we're going to invest, where we're going to divest, what types of ship platforms make the most sense for us. We're investing a lot in these LCS ships. We're still working hard to figure out the operational concepts for that. But that part of the beauty of that ship is that it's extremely flexible and agile platform, which I think is the direction we need to be heading with just about everything we have. So that's a really strong potential there. And they're not that expensive. In the grand scheme of things, $500 million to $600 million is what we're looking at for those ships fully outfitted. The frigate program is another one that addresses this. And we're looking to make an award on that this year. But that ship's going to have a lot of capability. And the way we approached that was also very creative, demanding that we work from a design that's already proven so we can get it out there a lot quicker. That whole process decreased the amount of time it took us to develop a ship by 3 or 4 years by doing it this way. So that ship's going to be also a very, very important element in our overall force mix going forward. But these are big questions that we're grappling with, that we have to come to an understanding. The challenge we have from going back to the 80s, when we had the 600 ship Navy, the average cost of our ship in that fleet was $1 billion. That's the average cost of all those 600 ships, right? Today, our current fleet of 290, the average cost of the ship is $2 billion. And that's in real dollars, inflation-adjusted real dollars. So what that suggests is that we're piling a lot more capability and a lot more expense onto a smaller number of platforms. And I'm not sure when we're looking at a scenario where we're dealing with great power like China or Russia, where we're going to have distributed global responsibilities, whether that's the right strategy for us. And so we're looking at that and re-examining that. Okay, number 9, speed. We are way too slow in just about every process that we have in the Department of Defense and the Department of the Navy. I use this example quite often about how it took me, when I got to the Pentagon, I would have breakfast in the Secretary of the Navy mess, and they didn't have English muffins. And so I said, okay, can we get English muffins? So, I figure I'm the number 2 guy in the department, and if he asks for English muffins, that should be something that happens like within, a day or 2. 6 weeks to get English muffins in the Department of Navy mess. And the only way it happened was because one of my special assistants actually got so frustrated that they didn't get the English muffins there. He went to the grocery store and bought a package of them and stuck them in the refrigerator, and the second happens. It's just emblematic of how difficult we make it on ourselves to do things quickly. And the geopolitical dynamics are changing so rapidly, just as they are in business and industry and everything else. We cannot continue to do things as slowly as we've done them in the past. So we look at that as it's one of the critical elements of agility that I think about, is that issue of velocity. How quickly can we do things? How quickly can we process things? How quickly can we test new technologies? How willing are we to fail? That's all got to do with speed, and so it's an area where I think we're making some progress in certain areas, but from my perspective, if you look at things like product development life cycles in the private sector, everything's contracting. And even our adversaries, everything's contracting for them. They are developing new technologies and spinning them out a lot quicker than we are, largely because they're stealing a lot of it from us, some of the fundamental technologies from us, which leapfrogs a whole research and development thing that we're investing in. But we have to figure out a way to circumvent that decline, because everything in government is going the other way. The product development life cycles are getting broader and broader and broader. And you look at our new carrier and some of the problems we were having with that. From when it was originally thought we would have that as a fully operating capability to what we're looking at now, it's years different, and that's just not acceptable. And so we have to think about and work really hard to address that. Number 8 is information. I kind of like to think about it coming from the private sector, having done mergers and acquisitions for 10 years. And then as a consultant in the private sector, I like to think about how we manage a department as how we manage key assets. And what are those key assets that we try to manage, and how we organize to do that. So the most important asset we manage is people. And we have an Assistant Secretary of the Navy for M&RA that's responsible for manpower reserve affairs. That's their focus. They look at that, they look at everything related to that, and they spend their time on that. Then we have stuff. Desks, ships, aircraft, inanimate objects, property, buildings, all over. And we have an Assistant Secretary of the Navy for that, research, development, and acquisition. Then I look at another key asset, money. We create money. We basically build a case for money. We go to the Congress appropriates that money from the Treasury, from the taxpayers, and then we are responsible for managing that life cycle. We have an Assistant Secretary of the Navy with the responsibility for that. The other key assets that we create that until recently we didn't have anyone responsible at the highest levels of the department to manage is information. We create information, we create data, it's all out there in our systems, very widely distributed, and until a couple weeks ago we didn't have anyone in the department who had the responsibility for figuring out how we turn that into a strategic advantage for us in the department. A, how do we protect it, and then how do we leverage that to create a strategic advantage against our competitors. So we've recently gone through the process of going outside of the department to find a new CIO. Basically, we couldn't get an Assistant Secretary of the Navy for this position, so we created a special assistant position for that. And we hired someone from private sector for that job. He has now organized the department around four key areas with respect to information management. The first is chief technology, because our underlying base technology, our networks, what we're investing in, very, very distributed decision making in the department on that, and that is not good with respect to ensuring that we have systems that interoperate with each other, or that operate well in conjunction with each other. A chief data officer. Our data is not ready for analytics because it resides in so many different systems. It's not tagged in a consistent way, and we don't have a broad data strategy in place yet. Chief digital transformation officer. That person is responsible for taking a look at how we move more towards a digitally based Navy. Most big companies, even your large industrial-based companies, and I'll give you an example. I went out to John Deere a couple weeks ago, and I can't talk too much detail about what they're doing, but they made a big bet on digital transformation a few years ago and set up an entirely new, separate operating unit to focus on digital transformation. And their approach has been incredibly successful. They're looking at how they can increase the product. Their mission is, how do we increase the productivity of the farmers who buy our equipment through the leveraging of information and data. And they're doing some really, really creative things. And they shared with us some things that have huge applicability to us in the Department of the Navy. So that's the third area. And then the last area is your Chief Information Security Officer, or sort of our cybersecurity officer. And many of you are aware that we had a study done about last year that started looking into some of the breaches that we've had in the industrial base. And so a lot of this reorganization was based in response to the problems we discovered in that process. And so we now have a person reporting to our CIO, and we're likely also going to set up a separate, because the Congress is asking us to do this, a separate independent cyber advisor to the Secretary and myself, who can sort of act as a third voice in the department on these issues. So that's something that the Congress is likely to impose on us. Number 7, cost. We have to figure out a way to drive down the cost of the equipment that we're purchasing, the way we deliver health care. I remember when I was running the Defense Business Board for Secretary Rumsfeld back in the early part of this century. The CEOs that were involved in this were basically telling Secretary Rumsfeld, hey, you got to define a burning platform. If you want to drive change, you got to define this burning platform so that people will get aligned around the urgency of changing the way the department does business in the business mission area. And they struggled. What do we come up with? The answer was, it's the budget. The budget is the burning platform. And they said at the time, there's no way the country can continue to afford this massive $320 billion a year defense budget. Where are we now? $750 billion a year defense budget. So that as a burning platform is probably a difficult one to get for people to wrap their heads around, because it seems like it always continues to go up. But we are reaching a point, I think, where it's going to start to cap out. And we have to think about how we do more with less, or how we stop doing certain things to invest in other things. As I mentioned before, the political dynamics are changing pretty rapidly, and we need to make sure that we're not investing in a force for the last conflict, but rather for what's going to keep the nation secure going forward. But it's going to be difficult to do that, particularly in the Navy, if we're throwing so much of our assets, of our dollars, into really, really expensive assets. Our carrier right now is the new carrier is $13 billion a piece. That's going to be really, really hard to sustain over an extended period of time. That's why we're doing creative things like we are with the frigate. How do we get a ship in under $1 billion? It still has a tremendous amount of capability with missile tubes and deployability that we need to be in more places around the world than we currently can be. So these are the types of things that we're looking at. Number 6, audit. The only question that Senator McCain asked me in my confirmation hearing was about the audit. It was after like a long rambling thing about something else, and then he said, so when's the Navy going to get an audit? And we just went through our first audit and this past year. And that process was very, very enlightening for us. We learned a lot about our business operations, some things that we knew, some things that we didn't know. But the whole value of the audit is to be able to identify these things so that we can understand where our money is going, so it can address all the other things on the list that I've talked to you about, like cost and information. Like, we don't have good information about our financials. It's going to be a long time before we actually pass an audit. But the discipline of going through it and making those corrections are making things very, very transparent to us, and that's where we need to be. I'll give you an example of one of the things that we found. We found a warehouse last year that had about $126 million of aircraft parts that we didn't even know existed. Not only did we not know that the parts existed, we didn't even know the warehouse existed. Okay, and they found this through the audit process. When they brought those parts into the inventory system, within a couple weeks, there were like $20 million in requisitions on those parts for aircraft that were down because we didn't know we had the parts in the inventory. Okay, and that's the value that we're getting out of this audit process, is we're doing a much better job understanding where our stuff is, right? and how much it costs us. And so we're going to continue to push forward with that. Our next audit opinion comes out here in a couple weeks. It's not going to be surprising in any way. And I mentioned this at the Congress when I testified. I said, don't expect us to get a clean audit opinion. I think a clean audit opinion for the Department of the Navy is a long way off. But that's not what really matters. What matters is, are we making the improvements that are necessary to understand ourselves better? The biggest challenge right now, I think, is our inventory. Inventory and then business systems. Our business systems are not well connected. They're very disparate, but most of those business systems lie within the logistics and the supply chain area. So we're embarking on a pretty significant effort to take a look at that entire end-to-end supply chain, make sure we have the proper ownership of it, and then designing a system with the right governance around it so we can get better data around inventory. Because it's billions of dollars that we don't have good accountability over, that we need to get much better at. And it's interesting because when you go to a ship itself, people say, oh, this is countercultural to the Navy to try and do this. Well, if you go to a ship, we sent the auditors out to the ships. There's like 99.9% accuracy on the inventory on the ship. So the ship knows. There's a culture there on the ship that knows exactly what's on there and where, what they need and so on and so forth. It's just when we get to the shore facilities, that's where we lose cognizance of it all. So we have to do a better job there. Number five is education. This has been one of my priorities since I came in. I mentioned this actually to the Secretary before I was sworn in, that I really wanted to focus on education. And so we launched something called the Education for Sea Power Study. Some of you may have read it, or at least some of the high-level elements of it last year. We had a very distinguished board of outside advisors who helped us look at this, as well as a small internal team that conducted a lot of the interviews. The board consisted of Admiral Mike Mullen, General John Allen, Barbara Barrett, Ambassador Barbara Barrett, who's now the Air Force Secretary, Dr. Harlan Ullman from the War College, and Vice Admiral Anne Rondeau, retired, who is now the president of Naval Postgraduate School, partially as a result of her work on this study, in addition to her own accomplishments in private sector as a university president. But what we found in the study was that the Navy had sort of ignored education as a key warfighter enabler and really deprioritized it. So we found things like at the Naval War College, where before World War II, 80–90% of the admirals or the senior leadership who fought World War II had gone through the War College. We were finding now 10%, 20% of our admirals had actually gone through the War College. We were sending, and no disparagement to doctors and dentists, but those are the people that we were sending to the War College. Whereas the Army and the Air Force and even the Marine Corps to some extent had really prioritized it. And so one of the big conclusions of this study was that we needed to unify our efforts across the Department of the Navy, leverage it, create a naval university system, and a naval community college process so that our enlisted sailors and Marines had an opportunity to earn college credit for some of the work that they were doing in the Navy, but also to have a universal transcript that followed them around as they progressed through different pieces of their tours, leveraging online data as well as in-resident courses based on wherever they're stationed. So we've hired a new chief learning officer who just got on board a couple months ago. He is the one that's pushing this, and his name's John Kroger. He was most recently the president of Reed College in Oregon. He's a former Marine, enlisted, and also a former federal prosecutor and former attorney general of the state of Oregon. A really, really talented guy with passion for helping us get this right. So I'm very encouraged about where this is headed, our education for sea power study and the outcomes of that. The Secretary signed out in, I believe it was February, the implementation memo, the action memo that implemented all the actions that we agreed to from the study. And we can get you a copy of that somehow. It's probably on the website, or Derek can help you get a copy of that. It lays out exactly what we're doing. Another key element to that, education for sea power, is that the Navy has created a new OPNAV organization called the N7. And they're going to carve education and put it in there. Education and experimentation will now reside there. Prior to that, it sat in N1, which is our personnel, basically our personnel branch. And if you looked at their pie chart for spending, education was in this big pie segment of the pie called trade space. And what that tells me is that it was not being protected. And so we're carving that budget out. We're going to identify it and protect it and invest in it. Because at the end of the day, as these warfighting technologies get more and more ubiquitous, and they're going to, our adversaries are going to get better. We have to get better as well. But at the end of the day, I think our enduring competitive advantage is going to be what's between the ears of the people that we put out in these jobs. And so we have to constantly invest in that, turn the Navy into more of a learning organization than it is today. And when I say the Navy, I mean the Department of the Navy writ large. And so that's what we're doing with education. Number 4, warriors. These are the folks that you all report on and interview and probably have a lot more interaction with than I do. But I have some concerns about where we are. We've been at war now for 19 years almost. And that's causing strain on our forces. It's causing strain on our families. And so it makes me very concerned about how long we can continue to sustain this and continue to recruit people. Right now, the Navy and Marine Corps is doing really well on recruiting. We have not seen, even though this is a very hot economy right now, we have not seen the impact so much in our recruiting efforts. But we need to continue to make the case for the Navy and the Marine Corps being great places for young people to come and to start their careers. And that gets harder and harder as opportunities in the private sector expand. So I'm concerned about that. We've seen some, I've been tracking the suicide issues that we've seen, the sexual assault issues that we are monitoring. And it's hard to draw conclusions from some of that data, largely because we just started really tracking it. So, and making it an issue. So you're seeing a lot more reporting. That doesn't mean that there was less of it going on before. There may have been more of that going on before, but now people are more comfortable reporting it. So we have to be really careful how we interpret the data. But it's still an issue in the service. And the suicide numbers, I just had a briefing on this yesterday. The suicide numbers are alarming, but they're alarming not just within the context of the service, but just generally in the population. We are not tracking any differently than what we're seeing in the population. And actually, in our demographic group, we're actually below the average per 100,000, the number of suicides per 100,000, than we see in society. But both of them are kind of going up. Both of those trends are kind of going up. So is it a societal thing? Some of the data suggests that it has absolutely nothing to, when they look at trying to track the correlation between whether or not suicides related to people who had spent time in combat over the last 10 years. There's no correlation. There's no statistically significant correlation between that. So it's interesting. And in fact, when we look at the suicide numbers, most of them do not, almost none of them happen when people are deployed. It happens when they're back here. And so I don't know what the answer to that is. We probably have a lot of reflecting to do as a society in terms of why that's happening. But still, it is a challenge and something that's on my mind. Number 3 is adversaries. We have, over the last 20 years, allowed our potential adversaries to get very, very capable. And I'm specifically talking about China and Russia, but also the Iranians, the North Koreans. And we have to think about how we defend ourselves very, very differently. And we're going through that process now. I think the National Defense Strategy that was published a year and a half or so ago is a step in the right direction. But we have to sort of operationalize that and understand what that means for us. What does it mean for us as a Navy to be in something called great power competition? It's a great tagline, I guess, but my perspective on this always has been that what happens over time is just the range of adversaries just get more diverse. So doing things in sort of gray operations that are not conventional, being very asymmetric. The Chinese are doing the same thing. They're establishing they've got a strategic vision for what they see as their future, and they're executing it in a very coordinated, nationally based way. That requires more than just the military to address. That requires, and I know Secretary Spencer mentioned this the other day, it requires a whole of government approach. I mean, how do we address a problem, for example, in the Philippines, where you have a shipyard in the Philippines that's in bankruptcy, and the Chinese want to come in there and buy it? And then one of our great allies in the Pacific has a big port and a shipyard that's owned by the Chinese government. What do we do about those types of things? These are whole of government types of challenges that we need to get a lot better at doing, because frankly, it's not what we do well. But we have to start doing it better. We have to start collaborating a lot better as a government, and understanding that there are all types of levers of power and tools of power that we need to employ. And I also think that we need to borrow a page from their playbook and start thinking a lot more asymmetrically as well. Because we can continue to spend ourselves to address every single challenge, and we can spend ourselves into oblivion trying to stop and be defensive and everything. And at the end of the day, something's going to sneak through. So we have to think about ways to complicate their thinking, make them uncertain, make them doubt their capabilities, and that's the full spectrum. That's the full spectrum. Okay, number 2 is time. My view is, I feel like I'm running out of time. And so what I've tried to do is focus, at least in my tenure here, in getting some institutional things in place that will endure beyond my tenure. And so created a CMO office to really serve as a catalyst in the organization to drive business reform. Created this new chief learning officer to drive and prioritize education, understand the budget and funding for education. Created a new CIO structure as well to drive after these data and information management challenges. But we really, to me, we're facing a significant time constraint on a lot of this. And we're going to have to push industry to work with us on this. We've sort of got ourselves in a little bit of a box because we only have a few large industries that can actually deliver and build what we need. Part of the problem we have with the carrier is that we've only got one supplier for that. And so, who else are we going to go to? I mean, and not that they're not a good partner. They delivered some incredible value to the country, and to the Department of the Navy. But we get in a situation like we are right now with the Ford. I think we can all see what happens when you only have one supplier. And if they don't perform, your ability to hold them accountable is very, very difficult. And that's a challenge that we have. And they also play a big role on our submarine programs. So everything is very, very tied together over a very, very limited supplier base. And we're sort of running out of time to try and solve this. And we need to get them to start thinking about how they do things faster, more efficiently, cheaper, et cetera. And we also need to think about how we diversify that supplier base. So as we start thinking about the frigate, for example, we're in a competition for that right now. We need to make sure that ship, when it comes in, helps us diversify our supplier base, that it doesn't sort of make it less competitive than it was before. And so we're looking at all those factors as we make decisions in this regard. Point about time. The other point about sort of this cost challenge that I mentioned before and how that relates to time. Back during the 600-ship Navy, we had carrier strike. Our carrier strike group, as a percentage of our overall operating costs in a year, was about 14%. Anyone got a guess on how much it is now? It's 31% of our operating costs is the carrier strike group, or the carrier air wing and the carrier. That's how much it costs. So we have to think about how we reverse that trend. And You know, the carrier is a great analogy because it's a big, huge ship, right? It's a big, huge ship, and there's so much a part of it. 5,000 people on the aircraft. It's like an analogy for the Navy. You got to turn that thing. You got to turn it to a different direction, and we got to start doing it quickly because we are under a lot of time constraints. The Chinese shipbuilding capability is immense right now, far outpacing our ability to do this. I was in Israel earlier this summer, and in Haifa port, they are investing in a brand new commercial port facility there. And this port is unbelievable. I mean, the land reclamation that they've done there for this port is really something. It's like, it's like a seventh wonder. It's amazing how big this is. And it's being built by a Chinese company. It's an Israeli company, but it's 100% owned by the Chinese. Okay. And so I asked the port director there, who's a former CNO of the Israeli Navy, like, why did you do this to the Chinese? Aren't you concerned about, losing some of your security by having such a large entity? And the line between a private company in China and the government in China is, it's not very distinct. So I asked him, I said, you concerned about that? He said he wasn't concerned about it. He said the bigger thing was no one else showed up to bid on it. It was basically the Chinese now have 70%, I think 70% of the port management capability in the world is Chinese. And no one from the US showed up. We don't have that capability anymore, which is hard to believe, given the ports that we have in this country and all the trade that we do internationally, that no one would show up to even bid on that. So we sort of created, to some extent, we've created these advantages for our adversaries because we sort of took our eye off the ball. We need to change that, and we need to change it fast. So the number one thing that would keep me up at night, if anything did, is you. It's the media who covers us. You guys have an incredibly important job, and your legacy of service is tremendous. I mean, you just go down and list the names, Matthew Brady and the Civil War and all those pictures he took that he documented the horrors of war. So people, average people who didn't go to the battlefield to go watch these battles could understand the implications of war. It was really an incredible service he did for humankind at that time when we started really moving into mechanized warfare. Incredible service he did. Robert Capa, the photographs he took at D-Day. There's one really good one of a soldier just kind of coming out of the water, and you look on his face. It's a combination of fear and determination, a true sort of American spirit coming through that water into uncertainty. Joseph Rosenthal, who captured the picture on Mount Suribachi, a picture that really has become the icon for the Marine Corps. That sense of teamwork and victory could not have been captured unless a member of your fraternity was not there on the scene. Dickie Chappelle. I just learned a little bit about her, that she actually was there during the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 on the streets of Budapest. My father escaped from Hungary in 1948, just before the revolution, and came to the United States. And I just spoke this past week at a celebration of that event, as well as the event 30 years ago, where they basically kicked the Soviet-imposed government out, and how proud they are of that. And reporters from the West who went there and reported on that story made a huge difference to them in terms of keeping their hope alive over all those years and demonstrating to the world what bravery meant and the importance of that value of freedom. James Foley, we all know about his tragic end, but the courage that he showed, just really significant, particularly in demonstrating to the world the barbaric nature of the adversaries that we were dealing with. And then, of course, Tim Hetherington and Chris Hondros, who lost their lives in Libya after being a part of documenting some really interesting the interesting lives of our Marines in Restrepo in Afghanistan. So it's a tremendous legacy of service that you all are a part of. And so you just want to impart to you that bravery comes in many, many different forms. And integrity matters. And connection to our military really matters. And I go around the country, and to some extent people look at our military members and they all say, thank you for your service. That's very obligatory. They say thank you for your service, thank you for your service. It's a lot different than when I joined the military, to be honest with you. And I think that's a very, very positive improvement. And I think you all have a lot to do with that in terms of how you cover these young people. But I also sense that there's a big disconnect in the general population with our military. That's sort of exacerbated over time. It's like, oh yeah, those guys, they go do that. Hey, thanks for your service. We're not doing enough, I don't think, to really sit down and talk to these people and ask them, what do you do? What did you do? How do you feel about the service? How do you feel about the Navy? How do you feel about the Marine Corps? So to the extent that you guys can bring that to light, it's a tremendous service that you do for the country by making that connection. So we need your help. We need you to stay honest, and we need you to keep us honest. It's a really, really important role. And so I trust that we're in a very partisan time right now. I'll tell you, I went to, this is not to self-aggrandize, but I was inducted into my high school Hall of Fame a couple weeks ago, Alumni Hall of Fame. And one of the speakers, who's from Washington, another awardee, I won't mention his name, but talked about how this is the most divisive time in the history of the country, and which I thought was kind of an interesting to say in an alumni Hall of Fame induction ceremony. But I just I totally disagree with that. I think we're in a sort of a hyper-partisan environment right now. But I think that, we fought a civil war, remember, in the 1860s, and people were, a million people died, close to that. We went to war in the 1940s against a very, very uncertain, with the prospects being very, very uncertain at that time. When I was growing up in the late 60s, cities were burning. Some of you remember that. Cities were burning. In 1968, cities were burning. The leading civil rights figure of our lifetime was assassinated. The leading presidential candidate was assassinated, all within 3 months of each other. I don't think we're anywhere near that right now. Part of it, I think, is what we see on television, where people are trying to get eyeballs, and so they're exacerbating differences. So all I ask you all to do, and I know that most of you are not engaged in that, but to keep it honest and to keep us honest. And you'll be doing a tremendous service that follows in the traditions of those great generals that I just mentioned. So thanks very much for your time. And thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for that. This has been a point of contention. The previous Chief of Naval Operations really emphasized that we do not talk about capabilities, and as a result, the Navy stopped talking about much of anything at all to the media and to the public in general. So I was curious how thinking on that point about transparency, about talking about what we're doing, what we need, what our concerns are, how that has evolved, and sort of what the current perspective is on engagement and about telling those stories.
Yeah, it's a really delicate balance. Every couple weeks, I'll read something in the Chinfo clips about some program manager saying, oh, we just successfully tested this particular capability on this particular rocket or this particular ship or whatever, and I'm like, why are we talking about this? Because, like I said before, we really have to focus on keeping our adversaries second-guessing themselves and complicating their solutions that they're going through. So, look, this is a fine balance we play in a democratic society. We want to be as transparent as we possibly can. Sometimes we have to make judgments that it doesn't make sense for us to be talking in too much detail about capabilities. But I don't know that that's different than it's ever been. I don't know. My experience has been on this job and the last time I was in the Pentagon. And my view is that I think we do a pretty good job of keeping you all informed, having active engagement. And if you don't think that's the case, then we can have a conversation about that. There are certain things I think that we view as critical capabilities that we just don't want people to know about because it just complicates their lives not knowing about it. And that's not a great answer, but it's it's just a balance that we always have to play.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Another question I wanted to ask, so the Marine Corps and the Army, to name two services at least, we're going to look for ways to divest old programs and capabilities and things that no longer are sort of relevant to the fight that we're looking forward to.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if there's any sort of parallel initiative being looked at for the Navy.
So I won't say anything about the Army other than be Army, so that's all I'm going to say about the Army. But as far as the Navy and Marine Corps are concerned, we are really, I think, really fortunate right now to have a Commandant and a CNO who are absolutely committed to working together on new force structure, to look at how that works as an integrated naval force. It's very refreshing. When we had this opportunity where both of them sort of arrived on the scene at the same time, I spoke to the Secretary about this. I said, this is an opportunity for us to get them aligned, and they were already ahead of the game on that. Particularly the Commandant, who within a couple days of being sworn in, he published his planning guidance, which was all about naval integration, how you integrate the naval forces together, which is the true legacy of the Marine Corps. I mean, that's why they're here. And so I've seen very little, it's been really interesting. I've seen very little resistance, inter-service rivalry within the Department of the Navy on this topic. It's amazing how the organization is lined up behind this. So it's really awesome because now, I mentioned before how we have to start thinking about new force structure and how that looks. And we have to do it with the two services aligned. So I think what we'll see coming out of this in the next couple, they did an interim force structure assessment in September. They've got a more final version of that coming out in December. And then they're going to do what they have to do. They're going to have to war game that out and understand how that works, what are the flaws, how does it work with the other services, the Air Force and the other one that I mentioned. And then we'll refine it over time. But I'm very encouraged because there seems to be a tremendous willingness by the senior leadership. And the Marine Corps is great because they're the Marine Corps. And so the Commandant says, this is what we're going to do, and they all salute and they go out and do it. The Navy's been the same way. I think Admiral Gilday's just been great in terms of embracing that and bringing his team along.
All right.
I'll let you control this.
Secretary Alan Kreischer, Sea Power Magazine. A couple of the things that you put on your priority list go together in the fact that we're once again under a CR. Budget problems, program problems.
Yeah, I need to change this list actually. I need to put CR on there somewhere.
Can you outline what I assume the Navy's been looking at the impact on both the short term and what if you get into the long term, what programs are going to be affected? And the Secretary has pointed out the $4 billion cost of the past CRs.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us an idea of the impact on programs and cost if this CR continues on?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic that the Congress will recognize what they're potentially doing to us here. But in terms of we're handicapped on all new starts under a CR. So anything that we were looking at starting out this year, from technology investments to things like awarding the new frigate, all those things are going to have to get put off. So it'll have a significant impact on us, and not in a good way. So we're hoping that the Congress will recognize this. I know the Secretary put a lot of pressure on them the other day with his comments at Brookings. I think it's sort of indisputable. It is their job to ensure that the military is funded, and so hopefully they will do that.
Sir, Megan Eckstein with USNI News. I wonder how the service is ensuring that those are kind of balanced to create, whole readiness. And the reason I ask, there had been a concerted effort to focus on aviation readiness, for example, but then there's still challenges with the aircraft carrier fleet to actually get them to the fight. I know you're doing a lot with cybersecurity and IT, but with the budget situation, struggling to get money for actual, bases and infrastructure. So I wonder what the service is talking about to try to ensure that you're getting all the right pieces together so that you have overarching readiness, I guess.
Yeah, so it's been a priority for the last 3 years since I've been there. It's the number one line of effort in the National Defense Strategy is to restore readiness. And so we are still focused on that. You don't dig out of a hole that was dug in over 6 years to 7 years in 2 years. So we're getting better. Significant improvements with the aircraft, with the F-18 readiness. The ship readiness is, that has been a problem of both funding and our process management and the capabilities of the shipyards and how modern they are and how quickly they can process things through. So we have a long-term shipyard modernization program in place to try and get to those types of problems. But you're right, they all sort of fit together. We also have to be, we also have to be investing in new capabilities. That probably means taking some risk in some older capabilities in order to do that. We're making a serious effort into hypersonics, and it's necessary. We're very, very far behind our adversaries on that, and we need to sort of close that gap. And so we're putting serious effort behind that. We are working very closely with the Air Force and the other service on that, and it's proceeding quite well. Yes.
I wanted to ask more about this warehouse with all these aircraft parts that you talked about. Where was it? What kind of parts were in the warehouse? Are they still usable? And what are we doing to make sure that doesn't happen?
What I would like to do is I would like to connect you with our FM people, and they can give you all the details on that. And I'm pretty sure that was in our audit report last year. The details of that were in the audit report last year that Ernst & Young did for us. One of the other problems that we discovered through the audit, which we did not have awareness of before, a lot of the inventory that we have that is being held by our vendors, our big OEM manufacturers to support us, they didn't have visibility into where those things were either. They had them, they knew they had them, but there was no way to tie them into a system to be able to go audit, where are those rocket motors. So we've gone back to them and imposed some standards on them this year so that this next year when we go through this, we think we've got that solved. But had we not done that audit, we never would have known that problem. So, and a lot of that stuff is detailed when are we signing out the audit letter? Next week, right?
2 weeks.
Yeah, 2 weeks. So the new audit report for this year will be coming out in a couple weeks, and that's a public document. You can find all kinds of information in there about how bad we are. You don't need me to tell you. But we've made some very, very good progress in a lot of areas, and I would say that our auditors tell us, and I think we believe them, and I sort of came from that. Worked for a big audit firm before coming to this job. The reason that our audit report is going to show a lot of deficiencies is because they went way deeper than some of the other services have gone so far, because we're more ready for that. And it was our expectation we would find out more as we got into this a little bit more. But one of the things we did last year was, as a result of the audit, was we were able to get 100% accountability on all our real property. So all of our buildings and facilities are now, we all know where they are. They're all rightly documented in the system. It's never happened before in the history of the Navy, of the Department of the Navy, that we had that level of accountability on our real property. So that's a big accomplishment for us. And so the challenge is sustaining that over time.
Russ Reed with the Washington Examiner, sir. Wanted to follow up on your point you made earlier where you said maybe it's time to take a page out of our adversary's book. What page is that, and what do those things look like?
Asymmetry. So doing things unconventionally, not trying to match them force on force, those types of things. Making it painful for them to attack us through cyber, rather than just continuing to try and put barriers up to keep them out, things like that.
Rick Burgess, Sea Power Magazine. In the 600 ship Navy, Secretary Lehman had a lot of bases built to accommodate the buildup. I guess it depends on the force structure system. Are you looking at what your basing requirements are for the buildup, and do we in fact have enough port structures?
Well, so again, that depends on what the number is and what that mix is going to look like. So I think we probably will have to invest. We're investing in facilities for the LCSs. We're bringing 32 LCSs or 31 LCSs online. They've got to go someplace. So right now, the Freedom variants are going down to Jacksonville primarily. The Independence variants are going to San Diego, and we're going to forward deploy a bunch of those. So yeah, that's part. You know, those are 32 ships that weren't in the inventory 5 years ago. So we are looking at different places and also places overseas. As we think about the Pacific and where we want to be in the Pacific, there are opportunities to not only increase our presence out there, but to hit that second line of effort in the National Defense Strategy, which is to strengthen our partnerships and alliances. I think the best way you do that is you work with them and you have some presence with them. So we're looking at all kinds of options in that regard.
Yes, sir. James Laporte from Newsweek. My question concerns suicide. As you correctly pointed out, that there is no statistical link between experience in combat and suicide. And actually, one study showed that if you've experienced in combat, that you're almost less likely to take your life. And you also stated that we need to be very careful about how we interpret data. So my question is, do we need a change in strategy? Do we need a new playbook?
That's the question I was asking the team yesterday. Yeah, we're having a bit of a spike this year, but the Marine Corps is going the other way. So it's really, really hard. And one of the things that they found that is clearly a preventative tool is connection, interpersonal connection with people. And I think that maybe that's part of what's. I'm not a social scientist on this kind of stuff or a psychologist, but I think that this is a societal problem. I think people get disconnected connected through electronic and digital means, and disconnected in much more personal ways. And so it's hard to sense a person's distress through the digital communications. And so we're finding that one-to-one personal connection is the one thing that's really helped to alleviate this problem. And but like I said, I think it's we're so uncertain about the true causal factors here. We do know some things about the demographics, like who's most likely. Mostly it's our more intelligent sailors. It's sailors who scored the highest on their academic type awards. It's mostly white males, much higher. Females, very, very low. So that kind of tracks with society as well. So I don't know, it suggests to me that there's something bigger at play here than just what the Navy and the Marine Corps are doing with respect to the pace of work and things like that. But we are seriously dedicated to this, and we're looking at trying to get answers as much as we can.
If I could ask you a follow-up.
Yeah.
You said it's one-to-one that seems to be working. It seems that most of the training happens in large scale. So when you go through regular suicide training, it is a large mass.
Mm-hmm.
We can take an example from Department of Education, where we know that small class sizes tend to work better than large class sizes.
Mm-hmm.
So is that an approach that the Navy is considering?
Yeah, yes. I mean, they're looking at all of these issues. They look at this. They've looked at the statistics of where they've had sort of interventions with people who had suicidal ideations, and they found that when someone engages with that person on a one-on-one basis, it has a very good result more often than not. Now you still lose people, But that seems to be the one factor they're finding. So yes, I mean, they're looking at how do we actually make that happen? How do we make it more real, rather than just sort of accepting that as the best answer. And you know, it's a challenge in a lot of different ways. We have the same challenge with sexual assault and sexual assault prevention. You know, there's so many hours in the day, and so you got to get the message out to as many people as you can. But you know that it's a lot of times that you know those sexual assault things, it's just an individual that never really understood what it meant or had some previous experience with sexual assault as a child, and found it to be either acceptable behavior. Like I said, I'm not a psychologist. These factors are multivariate, but I would say that we are very seriously looking at all of this and trying to figure out a way to help. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Clevenger from CQ Roll Call. Mr. Secretary, I'm interested in you talking about AI and dispersed sort of data sets. That same issue and that same sort of problem set was identified by the Defense Innovation Board, you know, January of 2017. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what's happened in the, you know, 2.5 years since, and you know, why are you still talking about the same issue?
Well, okay, we're going to be talking about this issue for the rest of my life, because AI is going to be a critical part of warfighting strategies going forward. So what's happened as a result of some of the div work that was done is that there have been a lot of disparate efforts going on looking at this problem. I think when Dana Deasy got in as the CIO, he's created this thing called the JAKE at the OSD level to develop a sort of a center of excellence that the services can leverage in the area of AI. But the biggest problem we have with AI right now is it's not level of investment or effort or concern about how important it's going to be. It's that our data is not ready. Our data is not structured in a way that AI can actually work with it. So key part, as I mentioned to you before, one of the 4 key elements of our CIO office is a Chief Data Strategy Officer. We have to become very, very clear about how we tag data, how we structure it, so that we can take advantage of those tools going forward. And right now, it's like it's just been very, very disparate efforts. And so we're trying to get our arms around, okay, what are we doing? What are we investing in this? How do we intend to use it? And that's the whole purpose of sort of elevating this to the secretariat level to take a look at it. So. And most, if you look at most, sorry, I'll get you guys in a second. It's not, it's a pattern that's been followed by all major corporations in which data is critical to them. And the ones that are leading in this are financial services and oil and gas. And they've done the same thing. I mentioned John Deere, they're doing the same thing. They went down a path where they tried to do this a few years ago, and they didn't structure in a way that allowed the data to be shared with other entities. And it sort of failed, and they had to go back and start again. So there's a whole element of structuring the data in a certain way, make sure it gets tagged in the proper way, but also so that it can be shared across the department, across perhaps federal space, and that takes a lot of governance and effort at senior levels to make sure that that happens. Because if you don't, if it's all distributed out there, you're going to end up with a mess. It's going to be like very similar to what our business systems environment is right now. Okay. Yes?
So I'm actually not with any publication. My name is Madison Brooks. I'm just a civilian, and I've been struck dumb by the information I've gotten here today from what you've been talking about. It's just shocking to me. One thing that stood out to me was you mentioned.
Struck smart.
Yeah, I mean it's fascinating. But one thing that struck me, you said, was you talked about how whole government solutions are needed, and you rightly identified the non-existent divide between government and private enterprise in China, and that most of the CEOs and presidents of major Chinese corporations, Tencent, Alibaba, Huawei, to name a few, their leadership are card-carrying members of central committees. Obviously, in the United States, there's a distinction between corporate America and government America. My question is, from your perspective, what can the U.S. government and even the military do to engage corporate America to start divesting from from the Chinese market, given that most of Chinese ascendancy has been built on the back of private corporate American investment in that country.
I think there are people in the country, in the Congress, in the leadership of the country, in the executive branch, who recognize this is a problem, and they're trying to address it by putting more pressure on companies to look at China differently, look at what they're giving up in order to chase after China as a market. And I think people are starting to wake up to it. And you know, some of these things that are happening right now, you know, in Hong Kong are pretty instructive. And so as people start recognizing that, you start realizing, you know, the whole NBA reaction to this has been fascinating to watch. Disney as well. You know, ultimately, I agree that these corporations are entities that have obligations fiduciary to their shareholders. But you know, they still make judgments. There were things that were done when you look at major colleges and universities during the era of apartheid, they divested themselves of South African interests in order to put pressure on South African government. It took a while, but you know, people finally woke up to it and realized what was going on. I think people are starting to become aware of it. People who deal in national security are definitely aware of it. It's when you go out other places, they're not quite as aware, and I think that just takes time. But I can tell you one thing, that this level of partisanship is not going to be helpful in developing an answer to that problem, because it's too distracting. And the Chinese aren't distracted, and neither are the Russians, okay, by internal politics and partisanship. And politics is fine. We should be having healthy debates about issues, but that's not what's going on right now.
This will be our last question.
You just made some disparaging remarks about Newport News and how they do business. It's been the sole supplier for a long time, nothing new about that. That's not going to change. Everybody in your position and their better position has been talking about getting costs down. Nothing new about that at all. They're working in a difficult position. They're building a ship that has incredibly complicated history. Are you now, is this a theme that we're starting to hear? Are you now going to, as the ship comes out, hopefully for trials, maybe since we've been sitting here, is this a new theme to start bashing on Newport News, which is, you know, maybe, you know, a couple of years ago we were doing this thing with Boeing, that's a Lockheed. Is this a tactic now that you're going to start complaining about Newport News and Huntington Ingalls and how they do business? And a second part of that is, this ship, hopefully, Gerald R. Ford, left Newport News this morning and is going out for sea trials. So she's going out again. In her previous underway period, 81 days at sea, not a single second was any media from any media outfit on board that ship. Pretty much unheard of for an American aircraft carrier. Everybody's hiding this. You're afraid, you're covering up, and you don't want people to see this ship. You don't want people to be aware of the problems. So in this upcoming period, as soon as she runs her trials, her post-PSA trials now, will there be an effort to get people out to see the most expensive ship anybody's ever built anywhere? Or are we going to continue hiding this ship from everybody? That's a two-part question. Thanks.
Okay, so let me answer the second question first. I have zero knowledge of what we've done with respect to the media and the Gerald Ford. My understanding is that they had 60 Minutes on the Gerald Ford.
Not
just
underway. Underway.
Okay. So I don't know the answer to that question. I will go back and I'll get an answer to that question. Because if there is some effort, which I sort of doubt, but to keep the media away from reporting on this, I don't think that's right. So let me find out why that's happening. Secondly, I've got no tactic here. Okay, I'm not here, you know, with some tactic to bash industry. I'm asking you guys to listen to what I have to say, the frustrations that we have, with industry in this environment that we're in, that we put ourselves in. We have a lot to, we as a Navy and as a Department of Defense have a lot to be held accountable for with respect to the Ford. Certain decisions that were made, put in all those new technologies at once on a new platform, and I think we're accepting responsibility for it. I think what the Secretary was trying to say was that it's the Navy that gets bashed on this, and there is a shared responsibility here between us and industry on this problem. And so, look, Mike Petters, who's the CEO of Huntington Ingalls, lived next door to me at the Naval Academy for 3 years. We were in the same company. He's a good guy, he's a smart guy, and he's a very effective executive, okay? I know he's trying to do everything he can, and I know all the people at Newport News are trying to do everything they can to make this thing right. But they've struggled, and I think they would admit they've struggled. So I just want to, like I said, I just don't, there's no like new strategy or tactic that we're out here trying to bash industry. That's not the case at all. We're just looking for, we're just trying to explain our position. You guys, as I mentioned before, let's be honest. Go out there and report on it. If you guys aren't getting access to it, and you're willing to honor certain things about, we really don't want you to discuss this in public because it's a key competitive technology that we don't want to advance, and you guys play well with those rules, then of course we want you there. So, like I said this at the beginning, this was my last point, that you all play an incredibly important role connecting the country to its military. And so there's no point in us trying to block you guys from that. So I will get an answer you can find out, okay? Can I just, let me close out one more thing. So, I think some of the things that I said were, like I'm trying to be honest with y'all, to tell you what are the things that are on my mind. We've got a lot of challenges in the Navy. But I don't want you, and a lot of these things make it difficult and make it seem like, wow, we're really screwed. But we're not. There's a few things that make me think that gives me a lot of hope. And the first one is that people are still willing to serve in the military. And I don't think we're going to lose. If we lose that, then we're in big trouble. Right now, I think we still have a lot of people from every single state, every generation, who recognizes the importance of the military and they want to serve. The second thing is I think we still have parents in the country who are raising kids to a higher calling, beyond just material wealth and self-aggrandizement. So I think that's another good thing. And I find this as I go out and talk to people and parents. And then I think that across the country, there's still a pretty big sea of goodwill and a sense of patriotism. And I think that's different, frankly, than it was when I joined the military in 1979. I think it was a very suspicious time between the country, the people, and the military that was there, that is asked to defend them. I don't see that now. So keep doing what you're doing, keep people informed. Like I said, keep us honest, but you all be honest too. Thanks very much.